Most people believe healing requires something dramatic. A breakdown, a crisis, a moment where everything collapses before it can be rebuilt. But neuroscience is beginning to suggest something very different. Some of the most profound psychological changes may not come from chaos at all. They may come from coherence, from a nervous system finally becoming quiet enough to function the way it was meant to. If you try to understand how the brain heals by reading scientific papers, you quickly run into a wall. Dense language, endless charts, statistical models that describe signals but rarely explain how healing actually happens, in a way that can be understood. The research is careful and necessary, but it is not written for ordinary people. It tells us that circuits change, but it rarely tells us what's actually going on when life itself begins to change. The data can show that neural activity becomes more stable. It can show that reward pathways begin responding again. But the graphs cannot help us understand what is really going on when someone wakes up and realizes the world feels entirely different. When motivation quietly returns. When anxiety loosens its grip. When the constant internal pressure finally fades. So this is an attempt to translate that science into something human, something easier to grasp. Not by simplifying it, but by reframing it. For years we have told ourselves a powerful story about healing. The story says transformation requires collapse. It requires chaos and disruption. It requires intensity. You see this belief everywhere in trauma work, in personal growth culture, and especially in conversations about psychedelics. The assumption is simple. The more intense the experience, the deeper the healing must be. But experiences like ibogaine complicate that story. Because yes, the experience itself can be intense, sometimes profoundly so. But the most meaningful changes people report are less about the experience itself, and more about what comes next. The true transformation happens afterward. Days later, sometimes weeks later. People describe clearer thinking, reduced compulsive pull, improved emotional regulation, and a quiet sense that something fundamental has reset underneath conscious effort. That timing suggests the peak experience may not be the engine of change. It may simply be the moment when the nervous system begins to retune. To understand that idea, imagine a guitar. A guitar is not just wood and strings. It becomes an instrument only when the strings are stretched across the frame at the right tension. That tension allows vibration to become music. Without it, nothing resonates. The human nervous system works in a similar way. It sits between the world and the self, translating every experience into emotion, motivation, memory, and behavior. It is the instrument through which life becomes audible, and like any instrument, it is extremely sensitive to its environment. If you leave a guitar outside in the rain or heat, nothing dramatic happens. No string suddenly snaps. Instead, the wood shifts slightly, the tuning pegs slip, the frame warps just enough to matter. Later, when someone strums the strings, the sound is wrong. Not broken, just out of tune. Human beings respond to stress in much the same way. Trauma, chronic pressure, instability, and loss slowly shift the tension across the nervous system. Over time, the system adapts in order to survive, but the tuning changes. Now the same events strike the strings of life, but the sound that comes out is different. Fear instead of curiosity, compulsion instead of choice, avoidance instead of engagement, craving instead of satisfaction. We give these patterns diagnostic labels such as addiction, PTSD, anxiety, depression, OCD, and eating disorders. But from another perspective, these may simply be different ways an instrument can fall out of tune. When a guitar is out of tune, the solution is obvious. You don't smash the instrument. You don't strike the strings harder. You retune it. You stabilize the frame. You adjust the tension until the system resonates again. Some emerging neuroscience suggests that compounds like ibogaine may briefly reopen plasticity in the brain. Plasticity simply means the brain becomes temporarily more capable of reorganizing itself and forming new connections. During that window, the nervous system may be able to recalibrate how it processes reward, motivation, and emotional signals. The system becomes quieter, more coordinated, less reactive. In trauma and compulsive disorders, vigilance is altering the tension on our strings, causing our behavior to go out of tune. The nervous system is always scanning, always braced, always preparing for or avoiding some threat. Continuing to strum along despite the sound may seem like strength, but it leads to exhaustion. When that baseline tension finally drops, the nervous system regains range. Memories can surface without panic. When that adjustment occurs, something remarkable can happen. Desire can exist without compulsion. Meaning stops being chased and begins to be perceived. The world itself has not changed, but the instrument interpreting it has. The same life strikes the strings, but the sound that comes out is coherent again. This idea extends far beyond any single compound. If stabilization and retuning are real mechanisms of healing, then many things suddenly become relevant. Therapy, supportive environments, neuromodulation, community, and structured recovery. Anything that helps the nervous system hold tension differently, without breaking, becomes part of the conversation. The future of mental health may not belong to whatever produces the most dramatic experience. It may belong to whatever restores resonance with the greatest precision. There is a reason musicians tune their instruments before they play. The sound we hear is always shaped by the tension inside the system. When that tension is wrong, nothing resonates the way it should, no matter how hard the strings are struck. So the real question may not be how much more force we can apply to the mind. Perhaps it is whether we are finally willing to listen closely enough to retune the pegs that have caused our sound to fall out of key.